A man lost his family and lived in silence. One day, he decided to dust off his deceased daughter's piano and found something inside that made him get up and go all the way. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The house stood at the edge of town, where new developments stopped and the road thinned into cracked asphalt and gravel. It had not changed in years, and that was not because it had been carefully preserved, but because nothing inside it had moved forward. The paint on the porch railings had peeled in long, dry strips. The mailbox leaned slightly to one side, as if it had grown tired of standing straight. The windows were clean, but dull, reflecting light without warmth. It was a house that had learned how to wait, and then forgotten what it was waiting for. He returned to it without ceremony. There was no sense of coming home, only the act of unlocking a door that had not been locked against him. The key turned easily. It always did. The house had never resisted him. It simply accepted his presence in the same way it accepted silence. He was a man in his mid-40s, broad-shouldered, with the posture of someone who had spent decades obeying orders and giving them. His hair had gone gray faster than he expected, not from age alone, but from years of interrupted sleep, deserts and mountains, briefings held at dawn, and the constant knowledge that at any moment someone else's life depended on his decisions. He had worn uniforms longer than he had worn civilian clothes. Even now, dressed in jeans and a dark shirt, there was something unfinished about him, as though he had stepped out of a role without fully leaving it behind. During his service, the house had been a place he passed through, a checkpoint between deployments, a structure that held his family while he was elsewhere. He used to think that was enough. He used to believe that being present in principle mattered more than being present in fact. He closed the door behind him and stood still for a moment, listening. There was no sound, except the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant ticking of a wall clock. No footsteps upstairs, no television murmuring in the background, no child calling his name from another room. The house no longer produced those sounds, but it still remembered them. Every room carried an echo that never quite faded. He set his bag down by the door and walked through the living room without turning on the lights. The furniture remained where it had always been. The couch still bore the faint impression of where his wife used to sit in the evenings, legs tucked beneath her, a book resting unread in her lap while she waited for a phone call that rarely came at a convenient hour. The coffee table held nothing but a thin layer of dust and a coaster he had not thrown away, because it still held the faint ring of a mug she once used. On the far side of the room stood the piano. It was an upright, old, but well-made, with dark wood that had lost its shine. It had been placed there deliberately, positioned near the window so that afternoon light could fall across the keys. His daughter had chosen the spot herself. She was small, serious for her age, and fiercely particular about certain things. She had said the light mattered. He remembered that much, though he had not been present when the piano was delivered. He had been overseas, watching the sun rise over a landscape that meant nothing to his child. The piano lid was closed. Dust lay thick across it, soft enough that it showed the faint outline of where his wife's hand had last rested. He did not touch it. He walked past, as he always did. The hallway led toward the back of the house, where two doors remained shut. One belonged to the guest room. The other belonged to his daughter. He did not open either. Instead, he went into the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water. He drank it standing by the sink, staring out at the yard. The grass had grown uneven, patches of green interrupted by dry earth. He used to mow it regularly. He could not remember when he stopped. Years earlier, he would have described himself as disciplined. He woke early, trained his body, kept his mind sharp. After the war ended for him, discipline slowly lost its shape. There was no gradual demanding it, no external voice insisting he remain alert. The courts and the appeals had taken over instead, filling his days with documents, meetings, and waiting rooms. When those ended, There was nothing left to replace them. The day he learned his daughter had died replayed in his mind, with a clarity that time had failed to dull. He had been inside a temporary operations center, a structure built for efficiency rather than comfort. The air smelled of metal, dust, and stale coffee. A briefing had just ended. He was still holding a tablet, scanning information that no longer mattered, when his phone vibrated. The signal was weak. It took 3 attempts before the call connected. The voice on the other end belonged to his wife. It was calm in a way that frightened him immediately. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She said his name once, as though confirming he was real, and then she told him their daughter was gone. There were details he remembered vividly, and others that vanished entirely. He remembered the way the room tilted slightly, though he did not fall. He remembered someone taking the tablet from his hand. He remembered asking a question he could not later recall. What he did not remember was sound. The world seemed to mute itself, as if recognizing that noise would be inappropriate. The explanation came later. A routine dental procedure, a local clinic they had used before, a reaction to medication, a tragic but rare complication. He returned home as quickly as protocol allowed, which was never quickly enough. The funeral passed like a sequence of images, viewed through thick glass. People spoke to him. He answered. He stood where he was told to stand. He did not cry then. He believed grief required permission, and he had not yet granted it to himself. His wife cried enough for both of them. In the months that followed, she began asking questions. At first they were quiet ones, asked late at night when she thought he was asleep. Why had the dosage been so high? Why had the monitoring equipment not been used? Why did the paperwork look incomplete? He told her they would look into it. He believed the system would correct itself once the truth was presented clearly. They hired lawyers. They filed complaints. They waited. What they encountered was not a direct refusal, but something far more exhausting. Delays, requests for additional documentation, expert opinions that contradicted one another while ultimately arriving at the same conclusion. No negligence, no criminal liability, an unfortunate outcome. The clinic belonged to a network. The network employed its own legal teams. The doctor continued practicing. The records remained sealed behind professional language that described failure without assigning blame. The strain hollowed his wife slowly. She replayed the day of the appointment again and again, searching for a moment she could undo. She blamed herself for choosing the clinic, for trusting the reassurance she had been given, for not calling him before agreeing to the procedure. He told her it was not her fault, but his words felt thin even to him. He had been absent. He had assumed there would always be time. A year after their daughter's death, his wife collapsed in the kitchen while making coffee. The paramedics arrived quickly. They did what they could. It was not enough. Her heart, worn down by grief and long nights without rest, simply stopped. There was no court for that loss, no appeal process, no responsible party to confront. After that, he stopped fighting. He moved through the days as though following instructions written in a language he barely understood. He ate because his body required it. He slept because exhaustion forced him to. He spoke to people when spoken to. The house filled with silence, not all at once, but gradually, as if it were seeping in through the walls. Now, standing alone in the kitchen, he finished his water and set the glass in the sink. He did not wash it immediately. Small tasks had become negotiable. He turned and walked back toward the living room. The piano waited where it always had. He paused this time, just for a moment longer than usual, his gaze resting on the dark outline of the instrument. He did not touch it. Not yet. The dust remained undisturbed. Outside, the light shifted, sliding across the floor and stopping at the edge of the piano's legs. The house breathed quietly around him, holding everything it had never released. He sat down on the couch, facing the instrument without intending to. He stayed there until the light faded and the room grew dim. For the first time in a long while, he did not feel entirely numb. There was a pressure in his chest, unfamiliar and unwelcome, but undeniably present. The house was still empty, but something, deep within its silence, had begun to stir. The night passed without dreams, or perhaps with too many for any single one to remain. He woke before dawn on the couch, his body stiff, his mind slow to return. For a few moments, he did not remember where he was. That happened more often than it used to. Then the shape of the room came back to him, followed by the weight of memory, settling into place as reliably as gravity. The piano stood across from him, barely visible in the gray light. It had not moved, yet it felt closer than it had the night before, as though the house itself had shifted around it. He sat up and ran a hand over his face. Sleep no longer restored him. It merely paused the exhaustion. He stood, stretched his shoulders out of habit, and went to the kitchen to make coffee. The machine whirred loudly in the quiet house, an intrusive sound that quickly died away. He drank the first cup standing, staring once again out the window, watching the sky lighten without interest. His days had become shapeless after his wife's death. At first, there had been paperwork, condolences, administrative necessities that forced him to engage with the world. When those ended, there was nothing to replace them. Friends from the service called at first, then less often. Civilian acquaintances drifted away more quickly. Grief, he had learned, was inconvenient for others. It made conversations awkward. It resisted solutions. He rarely left the house now. When he did, it was for necessities. Food, mail, appointments he could not postpone. He avoided places that reminded him of what he no longer had. The piano store they had visited together years ago was one of those places. He had waited in the car while his wife and daughter went inside. He remembered watching them through the window. His daughter's small figure animated with excitement, his wife's hand resting lightly on her shoulder. He had told himself there would be time to join them later. Later had not come. He carried his coffee back into the living room and stopped halfway across the floor. Without fully understanding why, he turned toward the piano. The dust on its surface looked thicker in the morning light. It dulled the wood, erased whatever warmth it once held. He stood there for a long time, his mug growing cold in his hand. He did not intend to play. He told himself that clearly. He simply wanted to look. The piano had always been something that belonged to his daughter. Even when she struggled with lessons, even when she complained about practicing, it was hers. He had never sat at it properly. He had never asked her to play for him. That realization pressed down on him with a force he had not expected. He set the mug down on the coffee table and approached the instrument slowly, as though it might object to his presence. He lifted the lid and exposed the keys. A fine layer of dust coated them as well, softening their color. He pressed one down tentatively. The sound that emerged was muted, imperfect, but unmistakably musical. The note lingered in the air longer than he expected. He lowered himself onto the bench. It creaked slightly beneath his weight. He placed both hands on the keys without purpose, resting them there, as if testing whether he was allowed to do this. His fingers were stiff. He had not played any instrument since his own childhood, and even then, it had been briefly, abandoned when discipline took him elsewhere. He pressed another key, then another. The sounds were disjointed, unskilled, but they filled the room in a way nothing else had since his daughter's laughter vanished from it. He stopped abruptly, his hands lifting away as though burned. The silence that followed felt different. Not empty, but expectant. He stood and closed the lid again. His chest felt tight. He told himself he should leave the piano alone. Instead, He fetched a cloth from the kitchen and returned to it. Cleaning had become one of the few activities that quieted his thoughts. It required no memory, no planning, only motion. He began wiping the top of the piano carefully, watching the dust gather on the cloth. Beneath it, the wood revealed a dull sheen. He worked slowly, methodically, the way he had once cleaned his equipment after long missions, knowing that neglect invited failure. As he cleaned, images surfaced uninvited. His daughter sitting on the bench, feet dangling because they could not reach the floor. Her tongue caught between her teeth as she concentrated, the way she looked over her shoulder whenever she heard the front door open, hoping it was him. He had missed most of those moments. He had told himself she was too young to remember his absences, that she would understand later. He moved to the sides of the piano, then to the back, bending slightly to reach the lower panels. His cloth brushed against a small latch near the rear, half hidden. He paused. He had not noticed it before. He crouched and examined it more closely. It led to a narrow compartment, part of the piano's internal structure. Normally, it would remain untouched, opened only for maintenance. He hesitated, then unlatched it. The panel opened with a soft sound. Inside, in the dim space where strings and wood met, something pale caught his eye. He reached in carefully and drew it out. It was a folded piece of paper. For a moment, he did nothing but stare at it. His hands trembled slightly. He knew, before he opened it, that it did not belong to him. That knowledge alone made it feel dangerous. He stood and carried it to the couch, sitting down as though his legs might give out. The paper was creased, worn at the edges. He unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was uneven, letters formed with care, but not confidence. A child's writing. The words were simple. There were spelling mistakes. The sentences were short. She wrote that she missed him, that she knew he was busy and important, that she did not want to make him sad by saying it too often. She wrote that she practiced every day because she wanted to play something special for him when he came home for good. She wrote that sometimes she pretended he was sitting on the couch listening. At the bottom, she had drawn a small heart and added that she loved him. The room blurred. He lowered his head and pressed the paper against his chest. The sound that escaped him was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was the sound of something breaking that had been held together far too tightly for far too long. He wept without restraint, the grief that had been deferred finally finding its way out. It was not anger that consumed him, nor even regret alone, but the realization that his daughter had waited for him quietly, without accusation, without demand. She had made room for his absence. He had not made room for her presence. When the tears subsided, he remained seated for a long time, the letter still in his hands. His breathing steadied. His mind, for the first time in years, focused sharply on something other than loss. This letter had been written before her death, before the clinic, before the explanations and the verdicts. It was a fragment of truth untouched by the system that had failed her. He rose and returned the paper to the piano compartment, closing it carefully. Not to hide it, but to keep it safe. Then he sat again at the bench. This time, he lifted the lid and placed his hands on the keys with intention. He did not know the melody she had wanted to play for him, but he would find it. As the first uncertain notes filled the room, something within him shifted. Grief remained. Loss remained. But beneath them, a quiet resolve began to form. The piano remembered his daughter. Now, so did he. The letter did not leave him after that morning. He did not carry it in his pocket or keep it unfolded on the table, but its presence followed him through the house as surely as his own shadow. Every room felt altered by it, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the words written in his daughter's uneven hand. He moved differently now, slower in some moments, more deliberate in others. The numbness that had once dulled everything had cracked, and through that crack came pain, sharp and undeniable, but also something else. A sense of responsibility that had not existed before in this form. For days he returned to the piano repeatedly, not to play well, because he could not, but to sit in front of it, to touch the keys, to remind himself that it was real. Each time he opened the compartment and reread the letter, the words cut no less deeply, but they no longer paralyzed him. They demanded something. He began to think differently about the past, about the courts, the hearings, the documents he and his wife had gathered with such hope and such exhaustion. At the time, he had approached the fight the way civilians were expected to. Hire the right people, trust the process, wait for justice to be delivered. He had believed that truth alone would be enough. The letter shattered that belief. His daughter had not waited for him loudly. She had waited quietly, adapting herself to his absence. The system had done the same. It had relied on silence, on endurance, on the assumption that grieving parents would eventually run out of strength. And they had. His wife had paid for that silence with her life. He had paid with years lost to emptiness. One evening, sitting at the kitchen table with the letter folded neatly beside him, he admitted something to himself for the first time. He had fought the clinic as a husband. He had fought it as a citizen. He had never fought it as a soldier. The realization unsettled him. He had left that part of himself behind when he retired, believing it belonged only to war zones and classified briefings. But the skills had not disappeared. They had simply gone unused, waiting. He retrieved the old boxes from the garage the next morning. They were filled with documents from the failed lawsuits, medical records, correspondence with attorneys, expert opinions that contradicted one another without consequence. He spread them across the dining table, organizing them not by date or source, but by relevance. Patterns emerged almost immediately. Phrases repeated. Terminology remained identical across supposedly independent reports. Dosages were listed without justification. Monitoring times were vague, rounded, convenient. He worked the way he once had in operations rooms, reconstructing timelines, identifying gaps, marking inconsistencies. He no longer read the documents as pleas for justice. He read them as intelligence. The more he studied, the clearer it became that his daughter's case was not an anomaly. The clinic had handled similar incidents before, each resolved quietly, each labeled unavoidable. The network behind it had resources far beyond what an ordinary family could challenge. They did not fear lawsuits. They absorbed them. He began reaching out, cautiously at first. Former staff members, nurses who had left suddenly, administrators who no longer returned calls. Some refused to speak. Others agreed only under conditions of anonymity. Fear threaded through every conversation. Careers had been destroyed for less, licenses revoked, lawsuits threatened. But fear cracked in small places. A nurse admitted that protocols were routinely ignored to save time. A pharmacist confirmed that cheaper substitutes were used without proper disclosure. A junior dentist confessed that complaints were discouraged, redirected, buried. Each testimony added weight. Each confirmation hardened his resolve. He was no longer driven by rage. Rage was noisy, predictable, easy to dismiss. What guided him now was something colder and more precise. Purpose. He stopped sleeping through the afternoons. He ate regularly. He exercised again, not to punish his body, but to prepare it. His house transformed slowly into a workspace. White boards replaced old photographs. Notes covered the refrigerator. The piano remained untouched during those hours, but the letter stayed close, a reminder of why he could not afford to stop. There were moments when doubt surfaced, when exhaustion crept back in and whispered that this would end the same way as before, that the system would close ranks, that his effort would vanish into legal language and procedural delays. During those moments, he returned to the piano, opened the compartment, and read his daughter's words again. She had believed he would come home for good someday. He could not undo his absence then, but he could refuse absence now. He began contacting journalists, not with accusations, but with evidence, not with emotion, but with patterns that demanded explanation. He chose carefully, favoring those who had challenged institutions before and survived. He released information in fragments, allowing each piece to stand on its own, to be verified independently. He did not reveal his full scope. He had learned patience in places where impatience meant death. As the first inquiries began, subtle pressure followed. Anonymous calls, emails questioning his credibility, suggestions that he should move on, focus on healing. He recognized the tactics immediately. They were not threats yet. They were tests. He did not respond. Instead, he went deeper. By the time the first article appeared, raising questions about a single clinic's practices, he had already mapped the network behind it. This was no longer about one child, one family. It was about a system that had normalized loss as collateral. Late one night, sitting alone at the piano bench, he placed his hands on the keys and played the few notes he had managed to learn so far. The melody was incomplete, broken by mistakes, but it existed. As the sound filled the room, he spoke aloud for the first time since finding the letter. "I'm here," he said quietly. The decision had already been made. He would not stop. Not until the silence that had protected them was broken completely. For the first time since his daughter's death, his life moved forward with direction. Not toward closure, because such a thing did not exist, but toward accountability. The war he had left behind had followed him home. The first public reaction came quietly, almost politely. A short article appeared in an online investigative column, framed carefully, asking questions rather than making accusations. It cited anonymized sources, referenced discrepancies in medical protocols, and mentioned a pattern of unresolved complaints tied to a single dental clinic. There were no names highlighted in bold, no dramatic conclusions. To most readers, it was just another piece of unsettling news in an endless stream of them. To him, it was confirmation that the door had opened. He read the article 3 times, not with satisfaction, but with the same detached focus he once applied to reconnaissance reports. What mattered was not what was said, but what was omitted, and how quickly the omissions would be challenged. Within hours, a response appeared from the clinic's legal department, dismissing the concerns as misleading and reiterating their commitment to patient safety. The language was familiar, neutral, impenetrable. He knew what would come next. His phone rang late that evening. The number was unfamiliar. He let it ring until it stopped. A voicemail followed, measured and professional, introducing the caller as a representative of a legal firm retained by healthcare providers in the region. The message suggested a conversation, framed as an opportunity to clarify misunderstandings and prevent unnecessary distress. He deleted it without replying. Pressure increased gradually. Emails arrived warning him about the consequences of spreading unverified information. A former colleague from the service, now working in private security, reached out under the guise of concern, advising him to be careful. The system did not strike immediately. It observed first, assessing whether he would retreat on his own. He did not. His days followed a rigid structure now. He woke before dawn, exercised, reviewed new information, cross-checked sources, and documented everything. His military discipline returned not as nostalgia, but as necessity. He understood that chaos benefited those in power. Order belonged to those who intended to endure. More testimonies surfaced. A former clinic manager provided internal emails detailing cost-cutting measures imposed by the network's executives. A pediatric anesthetist, stripped of his license years earlier after questioning dosage protocols, agreed to speak on record. Each new piece of evidence reinforced the same conclusion. The network had built its success on calculated risk, knowing that a certain number of adverse outcomes could be absorbed and obscured. The second article hit harder. Names appeared. Numbers followed. Patterns were no longer speculative. Regulators announced preliminary reviews. The tone shifted. Public outrage found its voice. That was when the system responded in earnest. His mailbox filled with legal notices, accusations of defamation, threats of civil action, attempts to link his efforts to personal vendetta, to emotional instability. They painted him not as a father seeking accountability, but as a disgruntled man unable to accept tragedy. He recognized the tactic immediately. Discredit the source, and the information would wither. They underestimated him. He released documentation that contradicted their narrative, carefully timed, each disclosure reinforcing the previous one. Journalists who had initially hesitated now leaned in, sensing momentum. Independent medical boards announced audits. A whistleblower hotline set up by a non-profit organization flooded with calls. The network's leadership issued statements promising cooperation. Behind the scenes, panic spread. Clinics closed temporarily for internal review. Employees were instructed not to speak to media. Lawyers worked around the clock. He observed it all from the quiet of his living room, the piano standing untouched nearby, the letter secured in its compartment. He did not feel triumph, only a steady, controlled vigilance. This was not victory. It was exposure. One evening, as rain battered the windows, a man arrived at his door unannounced. Middle-aged, expensive coat, polite smile. He introduced himself as a consultant authorized to negotiate. He spoke of settlements, of foundations that could be established in his daughter's name, of generous compensation in exchange for silence. The offer disgusted him more than any threat. He refused calmly, without raising his voice. He told the man that money had never been the objective. The consultant left without argument, his expression tightening just slightly as he realized persuasion would not work. Within weeks, the first clinic lost its operating license, then another. Investigations expanded beyond dentistry, uncovering similar practices in affiliated medical facilities. A criminal case was opened against the physician directly responsible for his daughter's treatment, no longer shielded by institutional protection. He attended none of the hearings. He followed the developments through reports and transcripts, detached but attentive. The system he confronted was not collapsing dramatically. It was unraveling slowly, thread by thread. The threats ceased. They had lost their leverage. Late one night, after a particularly long day of interviews and documentation, he sat at the piano and played the incomplete melody again. His fingers stumbled, but the sound was clearer now, more confident. As the final note faded, he understood something that surprised him. This was not about revenge. It never had been. It was about ensuring that silence could no longer be used as armor. The system had counted on grief to exhaust him, on time to erode his resolve, on his willingness to walk away. They had miscalculated. The war was no longer theoretical. It was visible now, undeniable and irreversible. And as the network he had exposed continued to fracture under scrutiny, he felt no satisfaction in its fall. Only the weight of what it had taken for the truth to surface. The piano stood quietly nearby, bearing witness. The final reckoning, he knew, was still ahead. When the last hearing concluded and the final report was released, the house did not change. The walls did not breathe easier. The rooms did not suddenly brighten. Silence remained what it had always been, but it had altered its character. It no longer pressed against him like a weight. It rested instead, neutral, almost respectful, as though acknowledging that something essential had passed through it and would not be undone. He read the report once, then placed it in a drawer and closed it. The names, the findings, the conclusions were no longer fuel. They were residue. What mattered had already happened. Clinics that once operated without scrutiny were closed or reorganized under supervision. Licenses had been revoked. Settlements were announced publicly, framed as accountability rather than charity. Families who had been dismissed as unfortunate exceptions were invited to speak, and their stories, once isolated, now formed a pattern impossible to ignore. He did not attend press conferences. He declined interviews that sought to cast him as a symbol. He answered when it mattered, and remained silent when it did not. The work he had set out to do had reached its natural end. Anything beyond that would have belonged to someone else. The mornings grew quieter. There were fewer emails to review, fewer calls to return. The house returned to a rhythm that did not revolve around urgency. For the first time since his wife's death, he felt the absence of obligation. It unsettled him at first. He had grown accustomed to carrying purpose like armor. Without it, he felt exposed. He filled the hours cautiously. He cooked meals instead of eating whatever was convenient. He walked the perimeter of the yard and trimmed back overgrowth. He opened windows and let air move through rooms that had remained closed for too long. These were not acts of renewal in the dramatic sense. They were acknowledgments. The house had not betrayed him. It had simply waited. The piano remained where it always had, near the window, catching the afternoon light. He approached it more often now, not as a task, but as a pause. He had found his daughter's old music books stacked neatly inside the bench, their corners worn, pages marked with small pencil notes. He traced those markings with his finger, imagining her concentration, the way she must have frowned slightly when something did not come easily. Learning the melody took time. It was simple on the page, but his hands resisted it, stiff from years of disuse. He practiced slowly, repeating the same measures until muscle memory replaced hesitation. Mistakes frustrated him more than he expected, not because he demanded perfection, but because each error felt like another missed moment, another delay. He reminded himself that learning was allowed to be imperfect. Sometimes, as he played, memories surfaced without warning. Not the sharp ones, not the phone call, or the courtroom, or the hospital room where his wife's heart had finally given up, but quieter images. His daughter sitting cross-legged on the floor with sheet music spread around her. His wife humming softly while cooking, the sound of laughter drifting down the hallway late at night. These memories no longer crippled him. They ached, but the ache was bearable. It reminded him that something had existed, fully and sincerely, and that its loss did not erase its value. One afternoon, while practicing, he reached the end of the melody for the first time without stopping. The final note lingered, clear and steady. He did not move immediately. He let the sound fade naturally, resisting the urge to fill the silence that followed. He realized then that he was not waiting for grief to disappear. He was learning how to live alongside it. The letter remained in the piano's compartment, folded exactly as it had been when he first found it. He read it less often now, but its presence grounded him. It had not been a command or an accusation. It had been a truth, spoken gently, without expectation of response. In honoring it, he had done more than confront a corrupt system. He had confronted himself. In the weeks that followed, he began meeting with families who reached out quietly, unsure whether they were allowed to hope. He did not offer promises. He listened. He explained what he could, and referred them to people who might help. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes it was not. He learned to accept both outcomes. The house changed gradually. A photograph returned to the mantel. The guest room door opened and stayed open. The dining table no longer served as a command center, but as a place to eat, to sit, to rest his hands when thinking became heavy. One evening, as the sun dipped low and light spilled across the piano keys, he sat down and played the melody again. This time, it flowed without interruption. Not because he had mastered it, but because he no longer feared the spaces between the notes. He allowed them to exist, just as he allowed silence to exist in the house. When he finished, he did not speak. He did not need to. The act itself was the answer. He understood, finally, that he could not return to the moment his daughter wrote the letter. He could not sit on the couch while she played for him as she had imagined. But he could sit here now. He could listen. He could be present in a way he had not known how to be before. The house held the sound gently, as though committing it to memory. Outside, evening settled in, unremarkable and steady. Inside, a man who had spent years running toward duty and away from home remained seated at the piano, hands resting on the keys, no longer searching for what had been lost, but honoring what had been given. The melody ended, and this time, he heard it all the way through. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. More stories like this are already waiting for you. Watch the next video and explore the rest on the channel. Share this video with someone who might need to hear it.